10 years of UGEC, past, present, future. And I'd like to introduce our panelists. You've met Karen Seto, she is the UGEC co-chair. Right next to her, Roberto Sanchez-Rodriguez, who's also the UGEC project co-chair. We have Bill Solecki, UGEC SSC member, and also David Simon, UGEC SSC member. And we wanted to just have, this session is only a half hour long, but we felt it would be a nice opportunity for you to hear a little bit more about what the UGEC project is, for those of you who may not be familiar with it. And these four panelists are not only SSC members, but they have been really involved since the very beginning of the project. As Karen mentioned earlier, actually these four were the co-authors of the UGEC Science Plan, along with a few others. And they've been engaged with the project ever since 2004, 2005. And so during this session, I hope it'll be informative and also interesting for you all to hear a little bit about UGEC from their perspective, and to see how, in 2005, we started as a very small community, as Karen mentioned, of urban and global environmental change scholars, and it's grown considerably over time, over the past decade. And also, here we are now, where urban research has really just exploded. And so, what we decided to do during this half hour is to have each of them come up and talk about the UGEC project and how they've seen it evolve over the course of this last decade. And so I think we'll go ahead and start with Roberto to come on up.
Well, thank you, Corrie. Thank you all for being here. It's really a pleasure to have this community help us in the synthesis process. What I thought I would like to do in my 5 minutes remarks about the UGEC history is just to provide you with a little bit of background of how UGEC came to be and a little bit of a perspective of what is expected in the coming years. And this is, what you see here is a timeline of different global environmental change projects. And I thought it was going to be, would be helpful to place where UGEC came around. And you can see that these global environmental change projects that you all know, basically the important component for us was ISDP, the International Human Dimensions Programs, created in 1996. We actually came late to the international arena. For some reason, social sciences appeared to be late into the global environmental debate. And UGEC, being a core project of ISDP, really was established until, as was mentioned, in 2006. It was the launch of the official launch of the project, even though the scoping group started working in 2002. It came out as a result of a reflection within ISDP of the need to really address the issue of urbanization. Before that, urbanization and global environmental change was addressed on a fragmented perspective. Particularly, it was part of the IT, the International Industrial Transformations Project. It was slightly part of the Global Environmental Change and Human Security Project, both of them from ISDP. And it was partly addressed later within the Carbon Project as part of the Persistent Science Project, the ASP, that was created in 2001, and to some extent part of the Global Water Project, of course part of the Global Dam Project that was shared at the time between ISDP and Global and IGBP. Well, before we move to the next one, can we go back one? What is interesting in this line is that what you see is the transition of the global environmental change community. And that transition includes the merging and disappearance, actually, of some of the global programs that you hear into what is expected, what is already Future Earth. Future Earth was launched last year, and that has been given steps into the formal studies in Future Earth. What this is interesting is because part of our synthesis here, synthesis process here, is not only to take stock of what have we done, what have we as a community done so far within the context of the interactions of urbanization and global environmental change, but also how do we move forward? What kind of science do we need to generate in the coming years to make it meaningful within the context of the global environmental change community? This is basically the conceptual framework of the science plan to UGEC, and at that time when we designed the science plan in 2004, 2005, and my colleagues all here were part of that, therefore we are the survivors of a larger group, of course. That means we are getting old, yes. And basically the concept, what it does is looks at the interactions between urbanization and global environmental change. From both points of view, these bidirectional interactions is not only what within the urban system affects the Earth system, or what the Earth system actually affects the urban system, but really we thought it was a dynamic process, a series of interactions of those within that process, in the sense that once there is an impact either from the urban system to the Earth system or vice versa, that impact in itself generates a series of other actions that are reflected in the series of arrows that you see here. And the science plan has 4 major themes reflecting these kind of interactions. And within each one of those themes, there are a series of other sub-themes and projects. What we have done so far in these years is really populate part of this perspective, and to some extent, what made sense in terms of the science plan in 2004 and 2005 when it was created is, of course, need to be updated, and it has to be revised, and particularly it has to be revised in light of the advancements that we as a community and the knowledge of global environmental change have achieved. Yes. And this reflection becomes meaningful in light of what is coming ahead, in light of future Earth. And future, these are the 3 big principles of future Earth. On one side is the center of the analysis is thus to be only the Earth system as was in the global environmental change community before, and start to focus more on people, and how people interact with the global environmental system. It also has a very strong element and focus on interdisciplinarity, and part of that is a reflection of the lack of capacity or ability within the global environmental change programs to really interact interdisciplinary, to create interdisciplinary research. And part of the reason why Future was created both by the international sponsors of the global environmental change community and the founders was precisely to get to the point of where these projects and these programs interact to really create a different type of knowledge. The third big element of this is the partnership between researchers, funded, and users. And there is a strong emphasis on users and the co-design of research. And this is because the gap between science and policy and practice has not been bridged, and part of the effort of Future is to get to this point. Yes. And these are the big top 3 themes that Future has in mind within the science community, and they focus on, first of all, the human and natural drivers of global environmental change. They focus on the human well-being, and there are much more details about the context of all of these elements, these themes in the website of Future Earth. And of course, they focus on global environmental change. The whole idea is that the program is capable of providing new perspectives, new pathways for sustainability. It is within this context that it becomes meaningful to think about what UGEC has achieved so far and what is ahead in the future. Because part of what we've done so far, both as part of the project, but as an international community addressing global urbanization and global environmental change, is a reflection of some of these elements to the extent, but it's not integrated so far. So a big challenge for us thinking about the synthesis process and how to move forward is how do we move from the kind of fragmented perspectives that we have achieved so far, and how do we move forward into these kind of dimensions. An additional component to that is that UGEC, or well, in this case, the urbanization team as part of the global environmental change community actually fits pretty well in all three of these elements. As Karen said, this is the century of the urbanization, and being a cross-cutting issue across what Future is intended to do, it's going to be very helpful in terms of thinking about what kind of projects can populate and the future environmental framework. Traditionally, it's just a major project like it was UGEC before, what the global environmental change community has so far. But given this context, what is the possibility, and what I'd like you to mention is that we can think about a series of projects, not only one single project addressing the issue of urbanization and global environmental change, that can actually help Future Earth start to provide more context to this framework. The other important additional element to this is the regional element. I mean, Future Earth is focusing more in terms of the global dimension, but with regional components. And UGEC has done an effort to address the issue of the regional component. We have a series of workshops. We have regional workshops in different parts of the world on different topics. We haven't made an effort to really expand our regional networks across regions in the globe. Not all of them have been completely successful the way we wanted, but it's an infrastructure that we can use to help provide different context to this issue. What is also highlighted here is one of the elements is the importance of interdisciplinarity that Future emphasized, and this is going to be not only for us as a challenge, but also an opportunity to provide and generate a different kind of knowledge that is going to be useful within this context. And finally, the final element is this co-design. When we first started UGEC, we thought it would be important for us to reach out to the practicing community, to include planners, to include other kind of decision makers that address the issue of urbanization and global environmental change. We were partially successful to some extent in that regard when we have the regional workshops, but not at the point that we feel comfortable to say that we have really co-design and knowledge in the sense that Future Aid is envisioning. But given the fact that Future Aid has made this strong emphasis, I believe this is an element that will help us really move forward in the definition of new kind of knowledge for the new pathways for sustainability. Thank you.
So you'll see a little bit of overlap between what Roberto spoke about and what I'm about to present. So Roberto just very quickly talked about the inception of UGEC, but I want to give a little bit more of a historical perspective of where we were in 2002, I think especially for the young scholars who were in the room. In 2002, there were already a lot of research on urbanization and global change. But it was, as Roberto said, incredibly fragmented. You had people in geography and economics and policy studies, developmental studies, looking at urbanization and primarily how urbanization drives local, regional, maybe a little bit of global change. But a lot of that research was highly contextual. And it was very difficult to compare what was happening in one region with another region, processes in one city with another city. And so when the scoping meeting occurred at the end of 2002, it was really an opportunity to bring together disparate communities of scholars who were already looking at this issue from very different perspectives. And so, as Roberto mentioned, there was this scoping report that basically made the argument that there needs to be an international project that brings together these scholars and very different perspectives. And what came out of that scoping meeting and scoping report is this science plan. And this science plan is it's a plan for 10 years of science. And in fact, the name project is a little bit misleading because we're really not a project. We're more like a program, but we don't have any funds to dispense to individual projects. I mean, what we are and what we've been for the last year is primarily a networking organization, and I would say if there's one thing that I think we as a community have really achieved in the last 10 years, I think there's really two things. One is I think that as a community we've been very successful in agenda setting at national and international levels. If I look back, and I'll show you some slides in a moment, if I look back at where urbanization and global change research was 10 years ago and where it is now in national and international discussions, especially in terms of funding, it's dramatically changed. So I think the issue of urban has really elevated from a local issue to much more of a global issue. And I think a lot of that is due to the work that many of you have been working on in this room. There's been some synthesis over the last few years and some integration across communities. A few years ago, the Urbanization and Global Environmental Change Project had a week-long workshop with the Global Land Project, and we produced this book on how do we rethink global land use in an urban era, in the urban century. For a long time, the Global Land Project thought about land and sustainable land use as separate from urban and separate from urbanization. And this week-long workshop was really an effort to bring together 40 of the world's leading scholars on these issues to wrestle with how do we reconcile land use, sustainable land use, with the fact that we're now an urbanizing world. I want to highlight a book that Sue Parnell here edited, and it highlights the work that's being done from many different communities, part of UGEC, that's really synthesizing a lot of work that's being done at local levels. And what we're seeing over the last 10 years is increasing synthesis and also comparisons of what's happening in different regions. We're seeing a lot of special issues that, again, bring together knowledge from different regions and very different experiences. And I think this is probably one of the biggest advances that the community has made, is to be able to say that there are a lot of science out there, but we need to honor that there are significant differences in processes. There isn't a thing called a single urban process that's happening at the global level. And in fact, if we talk about urbanization in Africa, North Africa is very different from South Africa, Southern Africa, and even within Southern Africa, we've got very different processes. Same thing in India and China. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do as we move forward is how do we honor and really reflect these very disparate processes, but also make sense of what it means at the global scale. Bill Solecki and I are editing a book that many of you in this room are contributing to, where hopefully it will be published next year, to synthesize work that's being done over the last 10 years. And one of the things that we're going to do over the next 3 days is probably tap a number of you to ask if you'd be willing to share your experience, to write short, maybe paragraph or page-long boxes that's going to go in this book that we're hoping will be a useful textbook to graduate-level students. As I said, I think one of the main accomplishments of this community is agenda setting. Now, some of you in this room might wonder, well, why would I be part of UGEC? What does this mean for me? I'm already doing research, I'm already successful in getting grants, and I'm publishing. What does UGEC mean for me? And I think here, one of the advantages of coming together as a community for conferences like these, and also as an international project, is that we're able to affect larger discussions and discourses that are happening. I want to highlight the IPCC report that was just recently published. If you look at all of the prior IPCC reports, urban areas and urbanization was dealt with in a very fragmented manner. In fact, if you look at AR4, how cities mitigate climate change was primarily dealt with through individual sectors, through the building sector, through the road sector, transport, energy. There wasn't a chapter on how cities could mitigate climate change. And yet we all know in this room that cities are the confluence of multiple sectors, very complex systems and very complex processes. So in fact, if we think about a systemic perspective on mitigation, it's very natural to use cities as a starting point. Which brings me to my next point about where we're going with UGEC science. As you know, the project is sunsetting in 2016, and IHDP is closing this year, and we're going to transition over to Future Earth. Where is UGEC science going over the next 10 years? A couple of weeks ago, I was in Copenhagen for the Sustainability Science Congress. And a major theme of that conference was the need to use a systems perspective. The language now has moved from transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and now the new phrase is complex systems perspective. And although that's kind of an exciting perspective, an exciting thing to think about in terms of thinking about the study of urbanization and cities, I think in reality it becomes a very challenging thing about how we actually implement that in our own science. How do we implement science where we bring together very different data sets, very different temporal dimensions, very different goals, and think about these as a complex system as opposed to an interdisciplinary perspective where we say, okay, let's bring the engineer, let's bring the economist, let's bring the geographer, the ecologist. I think that this is probably where the science is going, and I'm curious to hear over the next few days whether we're ready to take this challenge to move UGEC and urbanization research into more of a complex systems perspective. Two other things that I have here on the slide is this hashtag Urban SDG. As many of you know, the United Nations is in the process of rethinking the Millennium Development Goals. That program is also sunsetting, and the UN is in the process of thinking about and developing sustainable development goals. And there are a number of people in this room who have been instrumental in developing a standalone urban SDG. So I think that's another area where the science and research is going, moving away from, as Roberto said, pure science, but to much more of science for policy, science for decision making. And I think one of the main aspects of the urban SDG is, do we have the metrics and the indicators necessary to understand what sustainable urbanization looks like? Can we move away from a much more descriptive science to a science that says, well, these types of pathways will lead to low carbon development or that higher well-being or much more livable cities? And I'm not sure whether we're ready, this community, our science is ready to take that next step, and I think that's another issue of discussion. My third point here is the WBCSD. This is the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. As Roberto mentioned, when we designed this project, we were really cognizant to bring the practitioner community, the mayors, the planners, and try to have this dialogue between science and practice. But I think one thing that we omitted in this community is the business community. And it's very clear that the business community, the private sector, is going to be central to thinking about sustainable urbanization going into the future. Whether it's investments from the private sector in the development of infrastructure and the built environment, or investments in energy in cities. The business community has certainly a lot of experience, on-the-ground experience, and one of the questions that I want us to think about over the next 3 days is, how do we conceptualize and integrate and partner with that private sector community? Because currently much of our research, mine included, doesn't really have a space for the business and private sector. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Bill Solecki. Thank you. Passing it over to David Simon.
Thanks very much. I was beginning to wonder just there. I'm not going to use PowerPoint, and what I will contribute to this overview is take one continental example of how we have attempted from the very beginning to develop regionally based networks of researchers and colleagues from beyond academia, doing just as Roberto and Karen already have said, trying to collaborate to transcend some of these traditional boundaries and ensure that right from the beginning, rather than just as a sort of final process of dissemination of output at the end, we're interacting with many of the communities who will actually be using the outputs of the research and getting their inputs at different stages rather than purely as receivers, as it were, of completed research projects. And we have, with differing degrees of success in different regions, succeeded in developing ongoing networks of cognate researchers attempting to advance one or more of the four themes in the science plan that you saw in Roberto's PowerPoint. He in particular has driven a Latin American network. Karen has done the same in China and other parts of East Asia. Just a month ago, Darren McAvoy hosted a workshop in Vietnam for people from Southeast Asia, which was linked very much to one of the other activities we've undertaken right through the life of UGEC, which is training programs for doctoral students, other researchers, whether they be academics or in local authorities or NGOs or other forms of agencies, to increase capacity and to involve them in the nature of the work. And the region that I've led this through the last decade or so is in Africa, and we've attempted, despite the quite profound challenges of the linguistic and historically disparate regional fissures that bedevil attempts to undertake Africa-wide initiatives to involve and incorporate people from across the continent. And we have, at different points over the life of UGEC, ensured representation of at least one of those regions on the scientific steering committee at any one time. So we had Sue Parnell from Cape Town for a few years. We had Sheikh Gay, who's one of the senior management team of ENDA, Environment Development Firmont, based in Dakar. And currently we have Shuaib Rouassa from Makera, who in fact will be joining us here this week. So they represent 3 of the 4 major regions of the continent and have tried to ensure through that mechanism, and once they've stepped off the committee, they've remained as UGEC associates, that we integrate on the ground and articulate and maintain and develop these research communities. We've actually also had a program of rotating our scientific steering committee meetings regionally, and as we'll be doing at the end of this conference, piggybacking for reasons of economy of time and funds on the back of other workshops. So we had 2 of these in Africa, and associated with the second of those in Dakar a few years ago, we actually pulled together a network of mayors and other local authority leaders from West Africa to raise awareness of the issues, to expand our understanding of their politically driven perceptions of the processes and the challenges, often very short term, of addressing the needs of their constituents, who are trading quite literally in a daily sense the exigencies of meeting basic needs with that longer term scenario of addressing the challenges of climate and environmental change. And indeed, attending that and several other meetings in different parts of the continent has been seminal for many of us in trying to understand what it actually means to be operating at the interface and trying to reconcile the often conflicting pressures and to explain the importance of embedding climate change awareness, that sort of longer term perspective, in the daily practices, the mainstreaming, if you like, in the activities of local authorities, private sector, companies and other agencies, if there is to be a chance in the future of having them met, rather than regarding climate change interventions as yet another sort of shopping list item to go to donors with, or abandoning because politicians think of them as something that the next generation of leaders are going to have to address. And then, more recently, in line with the challenge that's already been outlined of synthesizing and bringing together these different communities, I ran a workshop 18 months ago at my university in the UK bringing together, we think for the very first time, researchers from right across the continent, not just sub-Saharan Africa, not just the Anglophone or the Francophone or the Lusophone or Arabophone world, but from across the continent, involving again people beyond academia in UN Habitat, with whom we have forged quite a deep and long-running partnership. And several of us have been involved, for instance, in authoring or editing chapters in 2 of the State of African Cities reports, and those in turn feed into the global reports that many of you are familiar with. But around this workshop last year, understanding the challenges and the progress that is being made in relation to climate change adaptation at all scales, from the community to the national, from around the continent. And we're currently editing the major papers from that conference as a special issue of Current Opinion in Environment and Sustainability that will be appearing, it's slated for April next year. And at the Planet Under Pressure conference in London a couple of years ago, which many of you were at, and which was one of the key stepping stones in the process of developing the Future Earth framework, we ran a couple of sessions bringing together researchers from right around the world, transcending the traditional global north, global south dichotomy. And again, some of the key papers on that have appeared earlier this year in a special issue of Urban Climate. And that finally brings me to mention our lamented late colleague Joanne Carmen. You'll see an immemorial note in the program, because she was instrumental in many of our initiatives, was undertaking research in South Africa, and indeed was responsible for helping us to position that special issue of Urban Climate before she sadly died earlier this year from cancer. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to say a few words about the UGEC project. I think one of the things that sort of has come up in the discussions we just heard is about the UGEC as an entity that created and has created and will create science products. I think one of the other threads that were in the conversations and the words that were put forward is about the process and how UGEC in some ways, I think, sort of helped forge a new understanding about how to create not just new and interesting science and meaningful science, but also a process through which that could be created and then also connected to policy as well. Excuse me. So I'm just sorry, say a few words, and then I think we'll close this part up and maybe open for questions. So just a few notes here in terms of this notion of connecting UGEC and the community connected with it to others. One of the principal objectives has been to sort of bring all that information out to various audiences and to engage with multiple audiences. And we've heard a little bit, in some ways this is touching on some of the things that others have mentioned. Young Scholar Workshops, which have been extended to 2002 and maybe before, even before UGEC was created. Regional meetings, which has been highlighted, topic-specific workshops, and of course broader conferences, this one, and of course the previous one at Arizona State University in 2010, and in the website and the newsletter, and other forum as well, to sort of bring the information of UGEC out to a wide audience. I think you can sort of bring forward a few kind of reflections on this process. I think that, and again, somewhat to be highlighted in others' comments, the regional meetings have been very important to sort of as distributional elements for bringing forward a range of different perspectives, not just sort of a set of more science-based, but also practitioner-based perspectives into the play. And then also this, in terms of the innovation process, and again, UGEC sort of, while we think of this now as somewhat commonplace, UGEC, at least from my perspective, was very much out front in forging this notion that through interdisciplinary work, innovation will emerge. And I think that's a strong thread that we can sort of look forward to and reflect on. The workshops, which have been held in a variety of academic settings and sort of locations, we've heard about some of them, others They're literally too many for me to sort of list through. But I think it's in those settings, those smaller settings, bringing sort of experts, 10 to 12 or so folks, that a lot of the breakthroughs, a lot of sort of the new innovations, some of the agenda setting that we heard about kind of emerged from as well. And that we can talk more about some of these topic areas and, of course, the products that have come from them. And I think this issue of working with stakeholders or sort of connecting the science and the policy, just to sort of highlight a little bit what Roberto had mentioned as well, is that this was something that we've continually pushed for. And I think that as someone on the science side, I recognize that this is not an issue that gets solved and resolved in a day, in a decade, but it is a continual, ongoing discussion. It needs to be revisited and re-engaged with, and we've made some progress, but not necessarily complete. And in terms of sort of looking forward, lessons learned and where to go from there, certainly we highlighted this notion of a sort of a movement and kind of a connection to the agenda of Future Earth, very much in the parlance of the moment in terms of collaborative learning, co-production of knowledge. This is something that I feel that was very much embedded in the UGEC experience, and now we're seeing it sort of flowering in different perspectives. I think it's particularly important, and as I sort of noted, this idea of engaging with the local. One of my own primary objectives, and I think many of the individuals who are connected with UGEC recognize the need to bring the science that they do to the local decision maker. And it's in that sort of collaborative, local to local sort of interaction where we start to see real traction for our science. While this is a process that's becoming, it is ongoing, I think we need to extend out to other audiences, and I think, picking up at Karen's point, the connection to NGOs, community-based organizations, informal entities within cities, but also the private sector, rapidly emerging as a very important player in this sort of science policy interconnection. And then I just sort of wanted to end off with sort of this last little bit. Part of my own experience, and I think we've sort of embedded it into UGEC, is this notion that the science is meaningful. The science is for not only discovery and new information, but it also is to help create a better world and to sort of push things forward. And I think if we look historically in many other contexts, in the US where I'm from or other countries as well, we see this as part of a tradition, in many cases connecting to rural areas or cultural practice or national development. And I think one of the things that UGEC sort of talked about and reflected on, in some ways, I think will leave a powerful legacy, is that we need to sort of integrate this and ingrain this into the urban experience as well. And that the university settings, the local science communities, and the local practitioners provide that real catalyst for defining those sustainability pathways and moving forward with as much speed as possible. So that's sort of a kind of an endpoint legacy issue that I think is still the process of becoming in UGEC, but that sort of extension process to sort of bring the science out to the community that I think is particularly valuable in my own reflections of the moment. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. I think those perspectives were very helpful, and we are running a bit over, but we've been talking for a while, and so I'd like to at least open it up for any comments or reflections or perhaps some questions for the panelists. We should have a microphone. Yeah.
Hi, thanks very much for those presentations. I wanted to pick up on the future Earth concept of co-production and ask you what degree you see that as a fairly significant challenge, co-production of knowledge as a fairly significant challenge to this kind of one-way flow from science to the world, from the enlightened to the unenlightened, and this kind of sense that the science tells us what to do and really we have to get it into the heads of everyone else. Because surely the concept of co-production is critical in principle of that kind of way of thinking about it. And yet I pick up a sense from actually all four of the presentations that a lot of the historical pattern of work has been, let's get some good knowledge and we find ways to get it out into these various communities, whether it's the private sector or the public sector, work with NGOs. That's sort of unidirectional science policy model. And I wonder if you see the next evolution of all of this as moving into a more truly equitable co-production model where you actually have to give up quite a bit of control and give up quite a bit of the knowledge constitution process in order to have real co-production.
So I think what we'll do is we'll take a few questions and maybe not address them right now, but perhaps later on throughout the conference we'll get back to those questions. So if we have a few more from the audience.
Oh, thank you. A quick question about, just provocatively to a certain extent, you mentioned the need to move towards complex system perspectives as sort of next boundary compared to interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. And personally, I come from the University of Lisbon in Portugal. I know how much we struggle to even get to discuss interdisciplinary matters. And I won't even talk about transdisciplinary. I'm just worried that if I have to go back and talk about complex system perspectives, I might just lose all my colleagues. But this is, of course, a slight provocation, but I think you know what I mean. Thanks.
Perhaps we could take one more. And could you please introduce yourselves before the question?
I can speak loudly. You hear me? Okay. University of Michigan.
Do you mind, just for the sake of the recording, would you mind speaking into the microphone?
Josh Neal, University of Michigan. I know some of you have been involved in the Future Earth discussions. I'm wondering if you can just give us a little more detail of where strategically that's going, particularly in relation to what UGEC's been doing and where you see the real strategic points in terms of this community particularly.
This afternoon, we actually have a session dedicated specifically to that question, and that's at 4 p.m. today, and you all are, of course, welcome to attend that. We'll go ahead and, I know the panelists have made notes of your questions, and we will address those during the rest of today, or perhaps over the next 2 days. I think we'll go ahead now and move into the next panel, which is moderated by Roberto. And in this panel, we have a few presentations, and there will be, I promise, much more time for dialogue. But I want to thank Karen, Bill, David, and Roberto. Thank you.